Good morning, everyone. By now, you've probably heard something about the Twitter files. Talks about all of the suppression of conservative speakers and conservative thought, and the Hunter Biden laptop story during the 2020 election. Now, the as it's been released so far, episode 1, quote quote, was released by journalist Matt Taibbi on his Twitter account, and there's a lot of things going on. He focused in specifically on the Hunter Biden laptop story, which was heavily suppressed by Twitter at the time. I encourage you to read through it and draw your own conclusions. These are my conclusions after reading through it. I'm going to touch a few of the things in there, but mainly we're talking about my reactions to what I have read. It's clear that Twitter was acting as a political arm in censoring and blocking problematic stories, mostly by direct personal contact with both lawmakers and law enforcement. This really does bring up some really strong implications here, and we need to be looking at this not just in terms of suppression of a political party, but suppression at the government's behest. I'll come back to that in a little bit here. A recent development, though, Twitter's lawyer Jim Baker was a long-term employee of the FBI. This lawyer was reviewing materials for release, and said lawyer was removed by Elon Musk. Now, some interesting things about Jim Baker is he was involved in the Russia collusion hoax. He was involved with the Steele dossier. Clearly, he had a specific he was either an asset of the FBI, not going to say that for sure, but he would definitely had a viewpoint inspired by his time at the FBI. And that is, of course, concerning. He was between the journalist and Elon Musk's release, and he was reviewing all those materials. And that blockage is now removed. According to what I read, there was some issues getting searches done in the Twitter files, and now that he is gone, those issues have been removed. So let's go on back and through here. As you continue on down, you see that Twitter very specifically was at the start of the whole laptop story was basically just went straight into suppressing it. They didn't really think about what they were doing. They just was like, this is a bad story. We're going to suppress it. We're going to stop it right here. And then they tried to justify it. And the more they tried to justify it, the harder it got for them to do so. In fact, when a member of Congress actually contacted them about this issue and said, is there some free speech implications here? They were like, oh, no. This is all policy. This is all, all the policies things. And this is how we're working on it. And obviously this is going to be an issue. And even when she kept pressing them to talk about the First Amendment implications of this, they didn't do so. The fact that when there's a lawmaker who's saying to you, you need to rethink your thought process, either you need to rethink it or you need to start being serious about what's going on. And I'll address some more of that too. The amazing thing is just the line, given the severe risks here and lessons of 2016, that is so illuminating. Namely, they believe that when the people are allowed to speak their own minds and think for themselves, they just might elect a Donald Trump. So they suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story in every way they could. They even banned Kayleigh McEnany, the press secretary at the time, for just mentioning the story. In the end, they kept trying to justify it. They couldn't do it. They tried to shoehorn it into their hacked materials policy, but that required a specific declaration that it was hacked materials from law enforcement. So let's move right on into the First Amendment issues. And then one of the arguments I've seen repeatedly is that, well, Donald Trump was the president at the time, not Joe Biden. Donald Trump was the president at the time, but Donald Trump is not all of government. Politicians from both parties were asking Twitter to block and suppress and thus censor things they didn't like. The FBI was doing likewise. They were having regular meetings with not just Twitter, but Facebook and other social media sites to talk through this entire time in the 2020 elections. They were clearly acting, if not at the direct request, often they were, but if they weren't acting at the exact direct request of government, they were acting in the ways they believed the government would want them to act. And this is where things get real sticky. Twitter broke their own policy in order to block and censor a damaging story with the hacked materials policy. Said policy required an official declaration in order for it to apply, but no such declaration was ever made. So therefore, they went into the block and the censor mode because they were afraid of the government that might come. And they had a leftist bent to their entire staff. In the end, government and politicians who are representing the federal government were working hand in hand with Twitter to censor stories, often with nothing more than link sent and a reply of handled. While both sides made use of this, neither side can be justified in doing so. In fact, it is entirely inexcusable to request the censorship of your enemies if you are a representative of government in any elected or unelected office. In addition, the political bias was clear. Right-leaning folks didn't have all the avenues that left-leaning ones did to suppress stories, and the blatantly liberal staff of Twitter leaned into that hard. In the end, the First Amendment implications are huge. Twitter receives Section 230 protection from litigation from the federal government under the guise of not being a publisher. But they still censored and promoted in a blatantly partisan fashion like an editor, applying rules more heavily against one side than the other, often at the behest of the politicians that would potentially regulate them. Sort of like when an organization donates to both sides, Democrats and Republicans, those multi-million-dollar donations to one side and the other one gets a token few thousand. They're just hedging their bets with a double helping of hypocrisy, just in case. So as the story has continued to unfold, Donald Trump, as this was released, called for the suspension of the Constitution in order to right this wrong. Despite the fact that one side has been calling for nothing less than the abolishment of the Constitution for years, this is not a good look for Donald Trump. The Constitution is a divinely inspired living document that is the foundational underpinnings of our nation, and any suspension thereof will be its destruction, and thus the destruction of our nation. In the end, though, when there's no thumb on the scales, candidates of principles tend to win. So take your thumb off the scales. Speaking of taking your thumb off the scales, Katie Hobbs, the Arizona Secretary of State that supervised her own election to the office of governor, was also caught in the Twitter files, or at least her office was. They were regularly having their opponents censored. Let the people speak. They'll make their own decisions. And they'll decide who's right and who's wrong. At least that's the view from my front porch. Sincerely, Brian.